Hello there. Might be a bit of a dodgy connection today for some reason, but we'll see. So, as we've been looking at IMVU Studio Beta, and particularly the normal and shininess maps, I thought it might be quite an interesting idea to make a little project that takes advantage of what we were looking at and basically goes through the process as a result of creating an object in Blender that we can get our high res and low res version from in order to make our normal maps, which we were talking about yesterday. So that's these ones. I'm not sure if we'll be able to do a shininess map from this, but so what we're going to make is just a cast bar of gold as an accessory that you just hold in your hand. So it's a simple object, but it'll allow us to go through and explore the process of not just creating an accessory item for IMVU, which we've done before, but what this will do in particular is take a look at the process of using Blender to create our high resolution, low resolution assets that we'll need. So first things first, we need to open the accessory file. Desktop. And because we're using Blender 2.832, is it 2? Hang on, which one is it? Yes. Oh, I need to I always forget to do this. Yeah, so 8.2, open, browse the files, and we want the accessory, male or female, it doesn't matter, but because we're using Blender 2.82, we need to disable load UI, because for some peculiar reason that is unfathomable, you know the word, Blender doesn't like the settings that are included with older versions of Blender files. So Blender 8.0 and 8.1, the starter files were originally created with 8.0, if I remember correctly, but the settings that are included in that for some reason get tripped up in 2.8. So we have to disable load UI so that we bring in, oh hang on, before we do that, what we need to do to double ensure that this works, new general, that resets the scene, so we're reset to the defaults of 8.2, and then we can open. It's a bit of a faff, but if we don't do this it causes problems. So select the file, disable, open. And then what we need to do is reset the project. So scale is 100. And our end and start clipping distances 2501. So close that. So that's the accessory file, or the accessory starter file, which has the avatar and all the different accessory skeletons that are needed for an accessory item. So what we're going to do is build a gold bar. So first thing we want to do, make sure the cursor is at grid center, because our objects are added wherever the cursor is located. So we're using the sidebar for that. And in view, we want 3D cursor. In this instance, it is at 0, 0, but we can do that from sidebar. So add our object, just going to add a mesh, cube, or we can use our manipulation tools. Just move this up into position so that we can get a sense of its scale. Let's disable all this text. So viewport, overlays, text information. Gets rid of a lot of other things as well, but it'll do for now. Scale, uniform scale. So we want to click anywhere other than the coloured arrows, and we uniformly scale. So we just want to create a rectangle of brick, roughly the size that we need it. So that'll do. Hold on. Right, so we've got our brick. Just do a little bit of basic editing. So edit mode. Select the top. Why is it not selecting the top? There we go. Scale that a little bit. So we've got something that looks like it's coming from a cast, and then what we can do with this is round off our edges. So do we want to well, let's try that first, and this is, where's the bevel tool? Oh, there's the bevel tool. So we can scroll our mouse to increase or decrease the number of, oh, hang on, what we want to do actually before we do that. So if you look at this object, we can see that the bevel that's applied is uneven. So its width differs depending on the edge that it was beveling. So this edge is much narrower, it's about half the width of this edge. And that's because, so we undo that, that's because when we were in object mode, we changed the shape of the object, which changes its scaling or its overall profile. Can we see that in here? Yes, so what we end up with is an object that's scaled unevenly. And when you do that and then try and edit the thing in edit mode, Blender uses these disparate scale values as the root. How's the best way to explain this? It's basically the root number that it uses to make subdivisions to do something. So if the number was 1 and we wanted to scale, it'll scale all of them evenly. But if the numbers are fractions and they don't match, it scales unevenly. So if this was 0.1, this was 0.3, and this was 0.7, we'd end up with different rates of scaling relative to the number that's at the root of the object. So we always have to, whenever we scale something in object mode, we have to fix it. That means object, apply, and if we watch these scale values in particular, so we've got 317, 691 and 213. So if you watch those, object, apply, rotation and scale, they'll all reset to 1. So that now means if we go back into edit mode and we use bevel, they scale evenly. So they're all the same width. Oh, we can't do it after the fact. It has to be done before. That's a bit... Don't use the bevel tool much. So we left click drag on the node, and that bevels our object. And then what we can do with these top edges is bevel those as well, but with a different value. Whoops. So that is just the basis of our brick. And what we're going to do with this now, object mode, let's turn on wireframe so we can see what we're looking at. Going to add shade smooth, so that just smooths our brick. Oh, I've got some wonky edge collapse there. So you have to be careful with bevel, because if you overdo it, the edges fold. So let's see if we can undo all of that and redo it. Check those edges of the corners. That's okay. Shade smooth. So that is our basic brick shape. I'm going to add a material to this. Call it brick. And this should be 0. So that's an IMVU compatible material name. And then what we'll do is go into shading, edit this material, and we may have to reset the view. So to this we're going to add image texture node. Going to create a new texture, so click new, call this brick, and the width, let's go with 512 by 256. Generated type, UV grid or color grid, and then OK. And then what we want to do is connect color output to base color input. And there we have a texture appearing because it's using the default UV map that's assigned to the cube or assigned to all objects when they're initially loaded. So the next bit is to edit this UV map in a UV editing workspace. So that's all we needed to do for the material. UV editing, again we have to reset the scene because Blender keeps different ones for each workspace. So that's that. Select our object and just focus in on it. So view, frame selected. So that replaces, what was that called? Don't remember what that was called. But that's pressing the numpad full stop. That just focuses on the object. So what we want to do is unwrap this so that we get a cleaner. That's the messy default UV map. So we want to unwrap this so that we get a cleaner map. And the simplest way to do this would be to, well, we could, so reset the view, viewport, front, we could do UV cube projection, and that gets us a UV map that looks like this. So what that does is it breaks the UV map down into sections based on a cubic projection. So that's the that's the bottom of the brick actually. That's the top. Then we've got side, and then we have to accommodate these two elements, so those sides. Or what people commonly do, so reset the view, viewport, front. So there are different ways that we can do this. So project from view, that gets us this, which is a single UV map, but it means that the texture is smushed across the entire length, because what it's doing is unwrapping the face and dragging that across the entire width of our brick. So it unwraps this section and then just drags it across the rest of the object onto the other side. So if we, depending on our orientation, we get a different UV. So that's the UV map that we've got. So depending on the orientation of the object relative to the scene, we get a different type of UV map. And this is a common way of unwrapping objects. It's a simple way of doing it. So we could do cylinder projection, which does a similar thing to box, but creates a cylinder that always tends to go miles but that has its own problems of texture stretching because it flattens out some of the top and bottom surfaces. We could also do spherical projection, and again we generally want to be in one of the orthographic views for this. So select all, and that gives us a similar, on an object like this, a similar UV map to the cylinder. Alternatively, what we could do is manually unwrap our object, and that means using seams. So we select a series of edges, mark these as seams. So UV marks seams, and it'll turn them orange. So those are now seams. So what we should be able to do with this now, select all, unwrap, and it produces a UV map like that. So just duplicate this for a second, because this relates to working with the normal maps. So let's do this one as a box unwrap. Right, select both objects. We can do multi-object editing now, so select both objects and just go into edit mode, and we have both objects selected. So these are our two types of UV map that we actually want to be using. So although you can unwrap your object however you want, for normal maps it's going to be important to unwrap your objects properly. And by properly, I mean that all the UVs are distinctly defined. So let's do this again. Duplicate. Edit mode. Front. And what do we do? Let's do a spherical. Right, so for the point of view of using normal maps, this one is no good. So any UV unwrapping that uses one of these cylinder projections, spherical projections, projection from view, or it doesn't matter what view, what UV is, mapping, that's the word I was looking for, what mapping is used. If it results in any sort of distortion, it won't work with normal maps. So what we want to do when we are making our objects is to make sure as best as possible that we have a clean and clear UV map. So as mentioned, that means that we have to have clearly defined UV faces and positioned UV vertices to get the best from normal maps, from using normal maps. In this particular instance, because we've made a brick, from a normal map's from the point of view of a normal map, this would be the best option, because we've got most of the, well, not most of the faces, a number of major surfaces joined together. But this one allows us more texture space to play around with. So we can use either or, just so long as we have the space to add them to our texture. So what we'll do is we'll go with this map because it lays it out very simply and we can see exactly what's going on. So what we want to do as well, select all, so do that and then snap to pixels, corner, we just want to snap everything to the pixels of the texture which act as an informal grid and locks everything in place. So if you're not familiar with editing in the UV editor, we've got our traditional widgets. So move or transform, translate, rotate, scale, and then we've got the universal one that includes move, scale, rotate in all of them. But when we're on that widget, we get this little 2D interface thing. If you click drag a corner, it'll scale uniformly. Click drag an edge, it scales along that axis. Click the X and it moves. And then click drag on the node and it rotates. And it just includes all the major widgets just in one tool. Put that back. Double check our UVs. Right, so we've got enough space there. That'll do. So it's that one we want to use. Double check. Yep. Just move these out of the way. Rename this so we know what it is. So we can do that in the outliner, double click and then type, or we can do it in object properties. And it automatically updates and shifts it down the, so there it is. Right, so what we can do now that we have a UV mapped low poly version, we can duplicate this, move it to one side, and then switch to sculpting workspace. That'll change the interface again. So let's get rid of the text info, reset the view. And then all we need to do is just some basic, simple sculpting. So what we want to. So we've got some options and properties to set. So we've got mirror active. So we've got the main paintbrush tool thingy icon, but we've also got an indicator suggesting that it's going to mirror down the middle, and we don't want that. So now, is that in tools? Yes, it is. Now, where is this? Symmetry. So we need to disable X mirror. So click that, disables it. So now, when we move the cursor over our point of contact, we no longer have the mirrored iteration on the other side. Let's see if we can focus frame selected. So we're rotating around our object. So we select the object. We have to do this in object mode. View, frame selected. Let's go back into sculpt mode. So now we are rotating easily around our object. So we've got all our brushes. There are all sorts of brushes. There's lots of them actually. And all we want to do is just some very simple structural changes to the mesh to make it look like it's a piece of cast gold. But to help this, what we can do is enable Dino Topo or Dino Topology, dynamic topology. Enable that. That's okay. What we can do is enable Wi-Fi. Oh, it is enabled. So what we can do now is, with that enabled, we can actually see what we're doing. But what Dino Topo or dynamic topology does is it will increase the detail of the mesh or the mesh structure the closer we are to our object. So we can do all sorts of things. And all you need to do is select your tool. So what have we got? Draw, draw sharp, clay, clay strips, layer, inflate, blob, crease, smooth. So that smooths, so that's going to be useful. So we can smooth out all that mess we just created. And there's nothing particularly sophisticated about this. It's not particularly complicated either. It's just don't be scared of the tools and just play around with them. And all we want to do is soften this up and grunge it up a little bit just to make it look like it's a bar of cast gold. So what else have we got? Flatten. What does that one do? Not as much as smooth. Fill, scrape, multiplane scrape, pinch, grab, elastic deform, snake hook, thumb, pose, nudge, rotate, slide, relax, simplify, mask. Oh, those are more complicated. Oh, and we have the grabbing tools as well. Okay, so let's just go back to draw. So what with some of these brushes, what you can do is click to add, and then I think it's hold shift down. Yeah, hold shift and it'll remove it. So it does the negative. So all I want to do is play around with this and get a very simple shaped object that looks like it's a lump of cast gold. So we can just mess around with this. Make it all bumpy. Happy little bumps. Just rough it in initially. Don't need to be too crazy with it. Not crazy, too caught up in the details. Let's just hide the avatar for now. Is there a draw sharp clay strips? So deflate. So that's inflate. So can we do shift? Yes, we can. It's not as aggressive. So we can change our brush strength. But we don't want to change the object too far outside the original. So we always want to try and keep it the same, more or less, physical dimensions. That'll do as a lumpy bit of gold. So exit sculpt mode. Let's check this size-wise. So it's still more or less within the bounds of our object. So what we can do with this now, so let's just rename this. This is gold low. This is gold high. So now that we've got two objects, one of them is UV unwrapped, and what we can do now is use our high res to bake to our low res its structure and create a set of normal maps. So what that does, as we were saying yesterday, is it translates or transfers the high resolution structure of the mesh to the UV map of the low resolution object. And for that we have to make sure that both objects occupy the same space, they're in the same position. Select our high res, then our low res. Make sure that we are in Cycles render engine. We're in Eevee at the moment, so switch to Cycles, and we get a few changes in the options, and one of them is bake. We want that, so click on that, then we get bake. And what we want here is selected to active. So the high res is our selected object, and the low res will be the active object. So that's selected last. So high res, low res. Then bake type, we want that to be normal. So click that. Tangent space. We can leave the swizzle stuff for the moment. Select it to active. And then what we can do is just bake that and see what happens. So click the bake button and it produces that. And that is our normal map. But we've got a couple of issues with these areas, because our high resolution mesh and low resolution mesh are too close together. So what we have to do with this, particularly for IMVU use, is increase the ray distance. So that should be increased. Let's try 1 first. Rebake. Oh, that's got rid of it. Oh no, mostly. So there's a little bit there. So let's increase that to 2 meters. Rebake. And that's got rid of all of it. So what we can do now is select the low res, take a look at our UV map, and we can see how the high resolution has been baked or translated or transferred to the UV map. So if we're taking particular note of what's going on at the edges, and we'll see what this does in a minute when we bring it into IMVU Studio. So what we can do with this is save this. So image, when we've done something like this, when we've created an image, the image menu has a little asterisk indicating that there's some data that's being generated that needs to be saved. So if we click that, we get a couple of options to save, save as, save a copy, save as. Don't want this on the desktop. Want this in accessories. So that's going to be called Gold Brick Normal. Want to select a lossless or non-compressed format, so we can use TIFF or Targa Raw or bitmap. RGB, not saving any alpha masks with this, and then just save as image. So once we've done that, what we can do is get this set up, our low res, so hide that, hide the high res. Switch all of these back on so we can see, whoops, apart from that. Skeletons. Right, so duplicate this so we have an original object in place, and just shove those two out of the way because we're going to manipulate this one. And put this in place in the avatar's hand. Let's switch to a local orientation, and that changes the widget's orientation to match the object, so it makes it easier to rotate and position. Let's hide those other gold bricks. So hide, hide. Right, so that's about right. So what we're going to do next, object selected, edit mode, select all, object data properties. We need to create a vertex group. So click on the plus sign. And that needs to be called, so double click, that needs to be called attachment root. And that's uppercase A and uppercase R of root. So uppercase A attachment and then uppercase R root. And then just assign all of that to our object. So double check, select, deselect. Back into object mode. What we want to do now is parent or connect the mesh to the skeleton that we're going to use, or the armature. In this instance, that is the left hand. So we can use the same object to make one for the right hand as well. So that's the one we're going to use. So select our object, modifier properties, add modifier, armature, and then we can click on the eyedropper, because if we use the normal way of doing this, which is to click on the box to select, it'll list all the skeletons or all the individual armatures that are included in the accessory file, and that's about 100 and something, or 80 something. No, is it 80? I think it's 80 plus. So what we can do is click the dropper and then click on the armature we want to use, and it'll pop into our object control box. So that is now telling us that our mesh is connected to that armature, and we can test it. Select the armature, switch to pose mode, and then just press the R key. Select the bones in turn, because there's two of them. There's the root bone. There are two bones. There's root, and there's accessory node or attachment node. And root bone is the one that controls the armature overall, but it also now controls our object. And what this does is it locates our object on the avatar. So when we load this, hopefully into IMVU Studio, it should be in place in the avatar's hand. So let's save this file, save as. Gold bar accessory 1, because you can never have enough gold. Then save as. So what we can do now is export our accessory gold bar, and for that, with accessories are kind of tricky for some peculiar reason to export, and the best way to do it is make sure that nothing is selected. So select none, why is that still highlighted? Oh, because we're in pose mode, that's why. So switch back to object mode, then select none. Right. Because what we're going to do is force IMVU to interpret all the armatures that are in this file or in this project, so that we can filter out and grab the two that we need. So we need that object and that object. And we have to force IMVU to do that by including all of the things that are in the scene in the FBX file. So we need to make sure that we have this named correctly so we can recognize it, because we've got several versions of this in the project. So that's our low mesh. Yeah, so that's okay. Right, so select none, and then file, export, FBX, and then we get the FBX export dialog. So we want to make sure that selected objects is blank, not used, so we deselect that. Everything else is okay. Geometry, that's okay. Armature, always deselect, add leaf bones, and we don't need any animation, so click that, and then export. So IMVU Studio Beta, let's see what this does. So close that, I'm going to close this and restart it because it was open from earlier. Just to be sure. Right, so we're going to create a new project. So create, and we want an accessory. We'll stick with the glasses because that's what we know. Then derive. So that's the default. And as per yesterday, left click rotates, right click strafes, middle scroll zooms, oh excuse me, middle scroll zooms, but middle click also rotates. So there's a bit of duplication there. Right, so we're going to replace those. We need to import our FBX. So click on the thingy icon, whatever those are called, then edit, import, find the FBX, so accessories, Blender 2.8, and we called it gold bar. There it is, gold bar accessory, open. Now hopefully this doesn't crash. Yeah, this is not going to work. This is the one thing that needs to be sorted out. It doesn't like... I have to close that. It does not like at all files that contain a lot of mesh data, and it cripples PC. So they need to sort that out, because what it's doing, what I suspect it's doing, is every skeleton that it sees, it has to parse those, calculate them, convert them, whatever it's doing, in order to bring that data in to Studio. We can get by with it, so let's just open as a comparison. Because that probably caused a few frame drops in the stream. So as a comparison, same file, accessories, go FBX import, load FBX. Obviously we can't use normal maps in this, but this is by way of import comparison. So this is what we would have expected. And what we want is 2 bones, 1 mesh. So there's gold low.mesh 0.01. This is 2. Mesh ID for that. Import. Blah de blah. Apply changes. And there is our gold bar. Obviously not positioned in the right place, so we then have to do LF hand, apply changes, and there is our gold bar in the hand. So for Studio, until they fix that problem, what we may need to do, unfortunately, is this. Double check. Okay. Select our objects that we want, invert the selection, delete everything, so all we have are our two objects, select none, so again we're making sure that nothing is in the scene other than nothing is selected in the scene, then try re-exporting that. So export FBX, let's just call this 1B so we have a comparison. Same settings, deselect selected objects, geometry, armatures, again always add leaf bones, deslitted, bake animations we don't need, export. Right, so now this should work. So let's do that again. Create. Female accessory. Glasses. Derive. Where are the glasses? It's not brought them in. Create accessories, glasses, derive, there we go. Right, so now import the FBX. Edit, import FBX 1B. There we go. It doesn't like files with a lot of skeletons in them. Too many skeletons in the closet. So set up FBX. Change the scale 0.01. Make sure to select attachment root, 2 bones, 1 mesh. So that's slightly different, but that's the one we want. Gold low dot mesh. It's got our brick texture. Import. And then we have to preview. So there is our gold bar. Oh, it's not replaced as spectacles. So let's set the node. We want this to be LF hand. LF hand. So it does put the brick in the hand. So how do we change mesh? Because we need to be able to We need to be able to change the mesh ID. Or do we swap them? That seems a bit unintuitive. Whoops, where's it gone? So that seems a bit unintuitive. So let's try that again. Edit, import. Whoops, cancel. Want a new project. So let's do that again. Create. Accessories. Glasses. Let's double check. Derive. Why has it got the male one there? Did we not select the female? Oh, well, let's try this. That's odd. Should be doing that. Right, so import. Like I say, this is buggy because it's still in beta. So set up FBX 0.01. Attachment root. That's okay. FBX import settings, so that's our material. So where do we set the mesh ID? Import. So it would be preferable to just be able to remove the mesh instead of assigning or reassigning the mesh that we import over the top of, because that then means that we've now got two mesh references. So submesh. So where do we change? Where do we just change that? This is bonkers. Oh, there we go. LF hand, preview. So this whole preview thing is going to drive people nuts. It's going to drive people nuts. So that's our brick in hand. So all we need to do now, let's look at our material. So it's brought in the TGA image, or the image that was associated with the object in Blender, it's automatically assigned that. So what we need to do is just create what we can do with that. Accessories. In fact, what we could probably do is just new, create, flood fill this yellow or a goldish color. That'll do. Save as. Gold brick. Diffuse. So export PNG. Export. Gold brick diffuse. So what we can do, click on the icon, that'll get the panel up, add the image that we just created. Gold brick. So we can add that. We'll preview it now just so we can see what happens. Oh, and of course he crosses his hands. Where's he gone? So that's our brick, the gold texture. What we may need to do, because there are problems with the TGA image format, so what we have to do is convert or resave our TGA that we exported, wherever that's gone. Where is that? There we go, normal. So we need to resave this as a PNG for the moment. Hopefully they will get TGA sorted out, because that's going to be the best option for normal maps. So export, normal. So we click on normal, add image, load in the PNG. So that's dropped it into the slot. So that's our brick. Will you stop changing pose? That's our brick. Go to preview. This is going to be quite frustrating to work with, I can see. Oops. So there, if it will let us, we can see the normal map is coming through on the brick. Will you stand still? So that is what we can do with normal maps. And that looks quite funny, actually. But what we can do next to make this even more super duper, let's Let's create a new project, a new file. We want this to be mid-toned-ish. Flood fill. That'll do. Go away, assistant. Filters. Add noise. Uniform or Gaussian? Gaussian. Save as. Shininess map. Export. PNG. Export. We'll leave it as it is. Save. So we've got our diffuse color, our normal map, and now what we can add is the shininess that we just created, wherever that's just gone. Gold brick PNG. That again drops it into the slot automatically. Preview that. So if you didn't follow the tutorials, the videos from yesterday and the day before, earlier this week, previewing is working by essentially sending the data back and forth between your local client, your computer, and IMVU for authentication, verification, whatever it's doing. So it's not going to be, the previewing is not going to be instant like it is with the old client. So there is our brick, and we haven't got the shininess, so let's turn the shininess up, which is a reflectivity. Let's turn it up to 50. Don't know why that keeps switching to blending composite mode. Preview again. So there are going to be these weights, these long weights, and of course it resets the view worse than the other one. So I've now got shiny highlights, although it's kind of tricky to see. In this view. But what we can do, reload this, don't save. Now that we've got high resolution, are we in pose mode? Yes, we were. Now that we've got these high resolution, low resolution objects, we can do all sorts of things with this. Cycles, bake. We have all sorts of different maps that we can create. I wonder if ambient occlusion will work. Nope, that's a bit... Baking is dependent on the scale of our scene, and because IMVU is 100 times larger than Blender's default, it does mean that the maps, the baking ability isn't as accurate as it could be for some of the maps. Which may mean doing something like this, which is kind of annoying to have to do, but some of the maps it has to be done. We have to shrink our objects down, and then it should do it. It's kind of doing something. Oops. Let's do apply. But this is one of the problems with working with IMVU's content creation process, is that because of the scale difference, it tends to mess certain things up. Because Blender is doing physically based rendering. So it's rendering content based on the physical size of objects, and if they're too large, it doesn't like it at all. Yeah, it's starting to work-ish. But that's kind of, to go to this length to do this is a bit... I have to play around with that. But essentially what it means, get rid of those, we don't need them. What it means is that we have an opportunity to create various different maps that we might be able to use in IMVU Studio. Yeah, we can kind of see the shininess, but it's mainly the normal map effect that we're looking at. So we've all we've got is just a flat diffuse texture. It's just a single color, but we can see, if you stop moving, and of course we can't get, so there we go, there's the shininess. And we can see all the bumpiness, all of this stuff. And in the corner, that's our normal map doing that. So we don't necessarily have to do complicated things to get something that looks quite interesting in IMVU Studio. And the normal map, so remember, the UV map, sorry, the normal map has been baked to the UV map, and it's calculated it in a way that we don't see any edges where we have edges on our UVs. So if we look at that in IMVU, we don't see any hard edges. It's just it looks like a continuous mesh. Although it's kind of tricky to see in this particular example because, oh, there we go. So we can't see any hard edges where you might expect them to be based on the way that the UV map is laid out. And that's what normal maps will allow if they're properly set up. So let's just save this, save as. So that is creating a little project, a little accessory item, gold bar, with normal maps and a shininess map. Let's reduce that a little bit. And as we discovered yesterday, we can also use the shininess map so let's make this a bit darker. To define certain characteristics make this really aggressive. Apply. Export. Just save over. Select and reload that. Where's it gone? There it is. Place. Where is he? It's a shame we can't get too close to these accessory items so that we can see them more closely. So that's our shininess that we can just about make out. But what we can do is use the shininess map to define the reflective nature of our object so it doesn't look quite uniform like a piece of plastic or glass, but instead has a more diffuse, but not diffuse, but diffuse as in not as so there we have. Oh dear, this is really going to be frustrating to work with. That's our diffuse map, shininess map with a more diffuse reflectivity that we could see if it would stop moving. So that's our shiny gold bar with our normal map. Let's try changing this a little bit. Don't want it to be quite so saturated. So save, export this, export. Yep. So add image, I'm going to overload, load over the top of, place, preview. Could do without it constantly resetting the view like that. Ooh, that looks like a loaf of bread. But still, we can see the normal map, the effect of the normal map. That looks quite interesting. So there we have a little project making a gold bar in Blender that we've baked our normal map for and used in IMVU Studio. So that's what we can do with Studio now, or that's what we can do for IMVU using Studio. But what we can do, the thing with the baking thing, is that we can create our texture in Blender. So if we wanted to let me reload this. Don't save. What we can do is play around with some of the properties that we have available to us in Blender to do certain things to the image, to the material. So that in Blender we can do things like play around with the material itself and how we want the object to look in Blender. And then bake those as a map depending on the options that we've got available. I wonder if we could do that. So let's try that. Just a quickie. Cycles, normal. So we want, let's try glossy. So there we go, there's a map that we might be able to use. Just select that, moved out of the way so we can, oh, it's very dark though. but we might be able to use that in IMVU. Let's do this as a PNG so we can save it straight out. Save image, and let's load that directly into IMVU. Preview, and this will see whether we can actually use a coloured shininess map. Doesn't look as if we can. And is it doing anything shiny? Doesn't look as if it is. So it may very well be that shininess maps are restricted to black and white or grayscale images. So not only does it reset the view, it resets the zoom value so you can't get close to the... Yeah, so they have to be, it looks like they have to be grayscale images. That's a shame. So let's put that back. Oh, that is frustrating. But we can at least see the shininess effect in place. And the normal map. Let's just freeze that. So there we can see the normal map effect, the shininess bit, and obviously the diffuse texture. You could make that much more artistic if you wanted. Just a flat colour, just to highlight the normal and specular, the shininess effect. So that's a little project, gold bar. So expect everybody to be making gold bars and testing them in IMVU Studio Beta, because they're relatively simple objects to create. So there's a little project. Gold bar accessory with normal map and shininess map, all made in Blender. Just make sure that you are in cycles when you are baking, so the options are available. But again, all we did was created our initial object and then did some very simple sculpting to mess up the shape a little bit to make it look like a cast bar of something. We then make sure that the two objects occupy the same space, and then to bake, select the high res, then the low res, select our option, which in this instance is normal. Where it's gone, there it is, normal, and then just bake. Oh, don't forget to set the ray distance, so increase that from the default, and then bake, and it creates our normal map for us. And then all we do is save that, and we can use it in IMVU. Just noticed something. Yeah, so let's save that again. Save as. Let's use this directly. So go straight to PNG, don't pass go. So our normal map is a little pixelated, the one that we baked earlier. We can just about make it out if we can get close enough to it, so it's a bit bobbly. Add image. Gold brick 2. Preview. And this may mean to make sure that you have smoothing enabled on both objects. Yes, it does. So make sure you have. You need to get some poses that are fixed. Make sure that smoothing is enabled so that you can get smoother surfaces. Yep, so that makes a difference. So we'll call it quits there. We've been going for an hour and 3/4. But that's a little project that's easy to do. So like I said, just start with a box, shape the box to something that looks like a rectangle or a brick. Bevel the edges. I'm going to switch to Eevee because Cycles taxes the system. Bevel your edges, and we've still got the bevel tool active actually. Bevel your edges, duplicate it, and then use the duplicate as your sculpting object, and just do some very basic editing to that. Doesn't have to be complicated. So use all the, well, not all the tools, but draw, smooth, and there are a couple of others that are useful. Just sculpt and then bake that as we just showed you, or as we just saw. Right. Not sure what the next video will be about, but we shall see you in it. May do a room. We're about due for some rooms. So that's taking a look at Studio. Oh, also, completely sort of off topic. So let's just save that. So if you've been following on with the videos that we have been doing, this is completely unrelated to what we've just been doing. So one of the problems that we encountered was the fact that when we make clothing items, we can't test our items in our 3D apps. So we load our items into IMVU, and we have to wait for IMVU to go through the avatar to go through all the different poses to be able to test whether our mesh deforms properly relative to the skeleton. So what I've now done for Blender is transferred or approximated the poses that we see the avatar go into when it's sat down, because sitting is the one that causes the problem, the sitting poses. So what we've now got available are static poses for each of the main poses that the avatar, oh, we can't load it with this, that the avatar cycles through. So when you are testing your clothing in IMVU, what you can do is select the skeleton. Once you've got your, so this is going to be the alternative clothing file essentially. So in pose mode, you create your item. In this instance, it's the skirt that we were looking at the other day. You can now select the skeleton, switch to dope sheet, and then the action editor. And then what we can do is now test the deformation of the clothing item with the poses that IMVU actually uses. And these are approximations of the pose because it's not clear exactly what bones IMVU has rotated to get the pose that they end up with, because there are several bones that could be used for some of them. It doesn't appear that they've used them all. So what we can do now is create our clothing item in the T pose and then just toggle through the other poses to test how our clothing items deforms. And this is applicable mainly for the seated poses, but they are set up so that we're also able to test the avatar and the clothing item relative to tops, not just bottoms. So this set will be available. Whoops. This set of poses will be available for making clothes with Blender for both male and female. And both sets of poses are different. So that's the female. So assume that's a clothing item there. T-pose, you use that as your pose to make your clothing around, and then just toggle through the different poses to check the item against. So those will be available and usable for clothing. But that's an aside. Right, we'll call it quits there, nearly 2 hours, so we shall see you on the next video, and apologies for any dropouts and pauses in the video. Lots of processor intensive applications open at the same time doing these things. So we will see you on the next stream. Bye for now, everyone.